arranger, guitar virtuoso, and one of the few musicians to play with 3 out of the 4 Beatles, plus a who's who of rock nobility. Welcome, live from LA, Laurence Juber.
Hello.
Hi, Laurence.
Hi, Laurence.
Hi, Laurence.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
We
Loud
hear you
and clear.
loud and clear.
I just one slight caveat. My roofers showed up this morning and they promised they're not going to be bashing. But if you hear the occasional blast of mariachi music, then that's not coming from my studio. It's coming from above.
As long as the beat is in time, we don't mind.
Well, there you go. Yeah.
So thanks for taking time, because I know you've got a very hectic schedule coming up, lots of touring, solo gigs with Airfoil, etc. And I think you've got a lecture coming up as well. We're all massive fans of Back to the Egg and that whole period of Wings in '79 and onwards. It was the second Wings album I ever bought, and one of my favorites, and much beloved by everyone here on the call. What we struggle to understand with, why did it get that sort of critical backlash at the time it was released? Because we thought it was fantastic. What's your theories, Laurence?
I think that's critics for you. You know, and also, I mean, the timing at that point was, you know, you coming out of this kind of period where you had Rumors, Saturday Night Fever, albums that were selling in the tens of millions, with, you know, multiple hit singles. And of course, Paul stalwartly refused to put the singles on the albums, you know, which goes back to the Beatles era. And so Goodnight Tonight, which was a big hit all over Europe and in the States, wasn't on the album. And I think that would have kind of given it a little bit of a kind of a boost to begin with. This still doesn't account for the fact that the critics just didn't, you know, they were always expecting another Abbey Road. And, you know, at some point, you know, they just kind of throw up their hands and say, well, we're not going to get one of those. But, you know, in the course of time, of course, the critics have reevaluated it. And it went from, I think, Rolling Stone had it as a 2-star, and then it became a 4-star. So I think that's just the nature of things. You know, some of the coolest records don't necessarily get immediate recognition.
Do you think Paul will go back and reevaluate it himself?
That's a tricky one, because I think that period, because this was kind of like Wings' swan song, you know, and my perception is that Linda was kind of just getting tired. You know, she's now got 4 kids, has done the world tour thing, and I think that she was getting tired. Paul was turning 40 and was going off in a different musical direction, and you can hear that, you know, with the post Back to the Egg stuff. I mean, beyond McCartney too, which, you know, was in and of itself kind of critically kind of like the critics weren't quite sure what to make of that one either. But again, that's been reevaluated in the course of time and has become kind of an iconic record for DJs, because it was really like very early experimentation with electronica. You know, even though Paul was doing it, you know, still in a very analog fashion, it just was a bit of a groundbreaking record there. I think that it was just, and when I joined the band, I knew that there had never been more than like a 2-3 year incarnation of Wings. So I knew that there was going to be kind of an end point anyway. But you know, from my perception, when we started on that record, Paul said, you know, you have to think of yourselves as a band. And while he wasn't doling out songwriting assignments like he did, you know, with one or other of the previous albums, nonetheless, we approached it very much as we're not just Paul's backing group, but we're actually kind of thinking as a band, which worked nicely, I think, for the duration of the record. And the record came out as a Wings album, not as a Paul McCartney and Wings album. But, you know, beyond that, I mean, we didn't really have much control over the the overall circumstances, the fact that it was reaching an end of a particular, I mean, the 70s were coming to an end. You know, Paul's immediate post Beatles incarnation in Wings was clearly, you know, about to fold, or at least as it became evident. But in the space that we did the record, I think that there was a lot of very band-like sensibility going on, and I think that that's reflected in the way in which the record turned out. There were, you know, there were some questions. For example, Chris Thomas, who co-produced the record, you know, and he did that in between the Sex Pistols and the Pretenders. I mean, it was, you know, Chris was kind of like the hot producer at the time, but he didn't get to use his own engineer. So Phil McDonald engineered the record, which was coming really from a more traditional kind of from the Beatles perspective in terms of sonically. I think that if Chris had his own way, the record might have had a bit more of a kind of a little more American sounding as opposed to British sounding. But that's not necessarily a bad thing that it sounded British, you know.
And if we can take you back to the sort of first time that you stepped into a recording studio with Paul, Linda and Denny, I think it was May 78, Rat Studios in St. John's Wood. I think that was the first session, according to the research I've done anyway.
First session was same time next year.
Same time next year, that's right. So recording that. How did you feel when you walked in the room, and how did that whole initial session go? Because I guess it's a critical period.
Well, we didn't do it at Abbey Road. We did it at RAK, R-A-K. And subsequently used the RAK mobile for the Scotland and Lim Castle sessions. So, you know, and I was used to walking into Abbey Road. I mean, I'd worked at Studio 2. In fact, when I got the call to go audition for Wings, I was working in Studio 2. It was very unusual to get a phone call, you know, in those days, pre-cell phones. You know, you didn't get calls at the studio unless something, you know, kind of major was going on. And I had never been upstairs into the control room because the musicians were always kind of like down in, you know, in the main room. And unless you were on the production team, you didn't go up. But I had to go upstairs to take a phone call. And, you know, so I got to see, you know, walk through the control room and see the console with the quadrant faders, you know, so the faders on the console, on those EMI consoles had kind of like a curve to them as opposed to being a straight throw. And just as a side note, the other day I was in a studio here in LA, a new studio that actually has that console. It's the same recording console that Dark Side of the Moon was recorded on. So there's kind of a little studioology there, as it were. But going into RAK, I mean, it was like another session. But except it was with Paul and Linda and Denny, and Steve Holley was, you know, it was his first session too. And I think, if I recall, we recorded that song fairly quickly. I mean, it only took maybe, you know, 3-4 takes to do. And then they subsequently overdubbed a string orchestra. The sad thing was, I mean, it was a great song, and a very classic kind of McCartney kind of movie-like ballad, but he didn't get it into the movie. Marvin Hamlish, who I'd previously worked with on The Spy Who Loved Me, was the one who ended up scoring the picture. And then the song they used was one that he'd written with Carol Bayer Sager, who was his significant other at the time.
I think same time next year never actually saw release until 1990 as a B-side, which is a great shame.
It was a little earlier. I think it wasn't 88. It was a bonus track on the Put It There single. Right. Yeah. And that had been remixed a couple of times. We did a remix of it on the very last session that we did in January of '81. And then I think it got remixed again before it was released. But there wasn't a lot to change about it because it was a fairly simple kind of piano, electric guitar, bass, drums, and strings kind of track.
And I think it was another month before you went up to Root Studios in Scotland and spent a whole month laying down a whole series of tracks there.
Not quite. We went up to Scotland at the end of May, where we rehearsed for a few weeks. We didn't do any recording, but we did shoot the video for I've Had Enough. Even though Steve and I weren't on the record, that was done right around the end of May, and it was a single camera shoot. So every scene had to be set up with, just for the one camera. So there were different camera angles that were set up. So it was like an all night thing. But which was fun because that was the first time we actually got to perform as Wings, even though we hadn't actually played on the record. Subsequent to that, we went to New York and met with Lee Eastman, Linda's dad, and started talking about just the business of being, getting integrated into the band. And we went back up to Scotland for the month of July, was when we started recording for Back to the Egg, seriously.
And you must have got really close, obviously, all living in the same space at that time.
Oh, yeah.
How quickly did the band start to gel as a five-piece?
Well, it really, immediately, because there was, Steve and I both brought our own musical experience to it, and just, we were doing, in that first go around in May, we were doing a lot of jamming. There was one point we were jamming on, I think Steve was playing keyboards, and I think Linda was playing drums. It was either Paul or Linda was playing drums, but Steve was playing this chord progression. No, Paul was playing guitar and Linda was playing drums. And Steve played this chord progression that ended up being the instrumental section of Old Siamsa. So, in modern kind of songwriting rules, Steve would have actually got songwriting credit for that. But in those days, if you came up with arranging ideas, you didn't, that just didn't work that way, especially when Paul McCartney's the boss, But there's an example of us kind of working together to create the arrangement. But, pretty much, there were some demos of the songs, but when we actually started recording seriously, we were just kind of making the songs work the way that they needed to work. And because of the personalities involved and the musicality involved, it just came out sounding like a band. And having a producer like Chris Thomas, who was very meticulous about guitar sounds, for example. So, I'd be playing and he'd come over and he'd tweak my amplifier behind my back and stuff like that. But, that's all cool stuff. I do the same thing when I'm producing people. So.
Well, we hope that one day we get to hear some of those demos on maybe an archive edition of Back to the Egg.
Yeah, it's funny because I know there was a cassette with various demos on, but I never got a copy of that. So I don't know what even exists anymore. They could have been traded by some EMI engineer for a bunch of Elvis stuff or something. That's how a lot of those bootlegs get out, is there's German engineers with like Elvis TV shows, or whatever, and then they trade for Beatles or Wings or whatever, or Springsteen. It's this kind of subculture.
So, Laurence, how would Paul McCartney typically present a song to you before that first band demo?
He would play it. He'd play it on guitar or piano or whatever. And that's, typically the way it gets done, is you just present the song and talk it through and then, start playing it down. The first one we recorded was To You, which was a very different song from Same Time Next Year. It was a very different musical direction. And so with that one, Paul was playing acoustic guitar and, just played the song down. And then we started recording it, and you just do it. Better to get the job started, and once you know kind of where you're going with it. And that was not that complicated. But you learn the chords, and you the drummer will get the groove, and away you go.
Laurence, you were saying that that To You was a very different kind of song to the other material. Was there a sense going?
Certainly very different from same time next year.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, did you get a sense going into the album that McCartney had got this plan to do, because it's almost 2 albums in one, isn't it? You've got the sort of the rocky stuff, and there's this other side of the record, which is the sort of, the ballads and the soft things. Was that a conscious decision? Did you get the sense that it's almost like a concept album, isn't it? But
kind of a concept album without a concept.
yeah.
I think part of the conceptualization of it, because Chris Thomas, brought kind of a conceptual thing, having worked with kind of the art rock, like Pink Floyd and Procol Harum and stuff, where you can kind of, and the fact is, I mean, a Beatles album was rockers and ballads too. I mean, it's just part of kind of Paul's general kind of operating principle. But certainly when we started, I mean, we did To You, we did Spin It On, we did Old Siam Sir. Those were the first batch. But then we did, when we were in Scotland in that first go round, we also did Love Awake, Winter Rose, and Arrow Through Me.
I think you did Cage as well in that whole period. Is that correct?
Cage we started it in Scotland, but we did more work on it when we got to Lim Castle. So, we'd started the process in July, and then took August off, and then went back we went into Lim Castle for all of September.
And Kate was originally intended to be on the album, I think, so it got bumped quite late on for Baby's Request. What was the sort of thing?
Baby's Request we did at Abbey Road. That was one, during the break, Paul and Linda were in the south of France on vacation, and they saw the Mills Brothers, kind of old, 30s style vocal group. And Paul decided he was going to write a song for them. So he wrote Baby's Request, and then we recorded it when we were at Abbey Road in October. And that was, if I recall, Denny played piano on that, and then Paul played bass, I played guitar. And then the funny thing with that one was that, there was room for a solo, and Paul, we were talking about like a trombone solo. And I said, well, in Studio One, Don Lasher, who's probably the greatest trombone player in the world, is recording right now. Do you want to bring him in? And he said, no, I'll do it myself. And Paul did it on a mini Moog, with this kind of faux trombone sound. But that's Paul, very much the self-sufficient one.
Laurence, I'm pretty sure that you were the most musically educated person that Paul had ever had in his band, certainly at that point. I don't know about since. Did you feel that you were allowed more input as a result of that? Because I know, for example, Henry McCulloch, one of his big beefs in Wings was that he didn't feel he had much input to be able to do his own thing. Do you think you were able to because of your education in music?
Well, I think one of the reasons that I was asked to join the band was because I was versatile, that I could play a lot of different styles. And I learned that from, because I had first worked with Denny on a David Essex TV show where Denny was a guest, and we did Go Now. And I didn't know for many years that shortly after that, Denny had called the musical director to find out if I was versatile, because they wanted a guitar player to replace Jimmy McCulloch, who wasn't just a rock guitar player, and both of my predecessors, fantastic guitar players, not necessarily with the same kind of rounded musicianship that I brought to it. And I've always been a bit of a chameleon in terms of I can change my colors depending on the context that I'm working in.
Yeah.
So for me, the joy of working with Paul really was more important to me than how often I got to play a lead guitar solo. Because the fact is that Paul has never been a big fan of extended solos. I mean, in more recent years, he's kind of, allowed more of that. But in those days, I mean, you got your 8 bars at the most.
Yeah.
And so I could understand Henry's frustration with that. Even though, I mean, you look at Henry's solo on My Love, where there's just this concentrated emotion that is just for the ages, because it's just such a perfect solo. But I didn't feel constrained because I was allowed a lot of my own input. You know, the first solo I recorded was for To You, when I was in the studio. Paul and Chris Thomas were in the control room, and Paul was manipulating an Eventide harmonizer in real time while I was playing. So any note that I would play, I would hear a different note in the headphones. So I was just going completely outside of the box in what I was doing. And Paul, you know, so it was like a kind of an intuitive process, a very improv kind of process. And, you know, that's a very different thing from just laying down kind of a balls to the wall solo type thing.
Yeah.
With Spin It On, when I overdubbed the solo sections on that, I was sitting in the control room next to Paul and just eyeball to eyeball, and, you know, just Paul bringing stuff out of me that I didn't know I could do. So it was very much, and that kind of synergy was really, you know, and that's something as a studio musician has always been a great motivator for me, is the synergy of working with great musicians and how the combination can kind of lead to something that is different from, you know, the whole is greater than the sum of the parts.
That's a very fast and frenetic solo on Spin It On. It's fantastic. Was that played in real time? It sounds almost like it's sped up.
No, it was real time. We didn't speed up the tape or anything. That would have been like, yeah, that would have been a pain to do that. No, it was just, you know, I mean, I was, you know, as a teenager and beyond, I was, you know, I became a big fan of like fusion. I mean, the stuff that I was listening to, I wasn't listening to Wings in the 70s. I was listening to like Mahavishnu Orchestra and Return to Forever, you know, kind of fusion bands, and listening to stuff that was really kind of pushing me to explore what I could do improvisationally without necessarily being confined to, you know, normal song structure, because on the kind of the commercial side of things, I never got to do more than 4 or 8 bars in a guitar solo on a record, you know. And so to try and kind of take that background and then integrate it into this Wings space, it was a wonderful opportunity.
Did Paul have much?
Sorry, can I just pick up on one thing you just said? So,
Sure.
Laurence, I think it's fair to say that probably everyone on the Beatles Zoom worships Paul McCartney. You've just said that playing eyeball to eyeball with him, it brought out something in you that only great people bring out. But what were your underlying feelings about Paul McCartney as a person and as a musician?
Well, I mean, it was very easy to get along with him and Linda. You know, it was very, it's very open. You know, and of course I was kind of, you know, I was kind of a junior partner there because, you know, they're 10 years older than me. But I found Linda very easy to get along with, very encouraging. And Paul, you know, is this kind of like, has this burning nucleus of creativity. And you can't help but be, you know, impressed and engaged with that.
Right.
And so it kind of lifted me, you know, to want to be able to really perform to the best of my ability and beyond for him. But as a person, very easy to work with, very easy to get along with. Was, you know, I think that was, especially when we were working in this, you know, up on the farm and having, you know, being in his natural environment, or especially Linda's natural environment, because she loved being up there. It was not difficult. It was, you know, it wasn't like clash of egos. I know, you know, Denny and Paul had been kind of, because they've been working together for so long, I think there was the beginnings of some friction there, but it didn't affect the work. And it you know, though we did socialize to some extent. because Paul and Linda had the kids up there too. So, you know, they're always in their family space.
Having worked with George Martin, did you think Paul's production style was informed by George Martin in any way? Did you see similarities?
That's a kind of that's a substantial question. You know, because George Martin was such an experienced producer and recognized what the lads were capable of and gave them, you know, the structure, but also the freedom. Paul, you know, Paul's very much the artist, you know, his artist as producer, as opposed to producer as producer. So that was why having Chris Thomas there as a counterbalance to be able to let Paul kind of just be the artist at times. But there were still times when Paul would say, okay, this is how I want it to be. And Chris would go along with that because, you know, that was his job. But I think that Paul's production style is perhaps less systematic than George Martin's, you know, but my experience of working with George Martin was with Cleo Lane and John Dankworth, which was a very different context. You know, you're dealing with Cleo Lane singing a Harold Arlen song is very different from Paul McCartney singing a new Paul McCartney song, you know. So I think that it's a different style of production. And, you know, I've never worked with any two record producers that work the same way, exactly the same way. So, you know, you kind of go with the flow, as it were.
Did you get some sense of why Chris Thomas? Sorry.
Laurence, can I ask you, was there a reaction to London Town being panned by the critics as being a bit of a soft album? It happens to be my favorite, by the way. But Back to the Egg's not far behind. But was there a conscious attempt to become more new wave, do you think? And was there many discussions about that?
Well, I think that the new wave thing was just starting at that period. But punk was pretty well established. And, you know, I know that Heather had been playing a lot of kind of punk records. There was also, I mean, reggae was always, you know, not far away too. But I think that because Back to the Egg was Paul's first record for Columbia, wasn't a Capitol, wasn't going to be an EMI Capitol release. I mean, it was EMI in England, but it was for a new American record label. There was a certain amount of, I don't know whether it was pressure, but at least suggestion to do something that was more rock and roll than London Town, because London Town was kind of a folky album, largely. Even though I've Had Enough was, you know, essentially a rock song. But I think there was kind of a push to go in a more rock direction, which at least, you know, when we started, that was the primary direction that we were going in. And I think that, you know, but being with Columbia made a difference because there were different people to be impressed with what was going on. And interestingly enough, just as a side note, our A&R man at Columbia was Paul Atkinson. And Paul was, you know, the lead guitarist with the Zombies. So, you know, Paul had this kind of like, you know, English, you know, British invasion history, as it were. He later went on to run RCA and signed Jefferson Starship and Bruce Hornsby and Scandal, and was responsible for the Dirty Dancing soundtrack that I played on. You know, so having a visit from the American A&R guy was something that was a little different from what, you know, where Paul would normally be just be on his own in terms of what he would deliver to EMI. I don't know how much any of that made a difference. I think some of it was just the zeitgeist. It was what was going on musically in 1978 when we started making the record, and Paul being very sensitive to that. But, you know, same thing with Good Night Tonight was in my estimation, was never a disco record, even though it got classified as such. It was kind of a Latin dance record. And Paul was really responding to, he and Linda went out dancing one night, and that inspired him to write the song. He'd be inspired by whatever was going on around him. I think it's actually kind of interesting that the last two Wings hit singles were both dance records, because Coming Up was, was a nice up-tempo beat, and kind of the live version kind of knocked Paul's studio version out of the way, but that's a whole other story.
What was Paul's relationship with Chris Thomas actually like when it came down to it? Was Chris there to try and encourage Paul maybe to be a bit more cutting edge or a bit more?
Yeah, I think
raw?
so. I think that, Chris was there to bring some of that sensibility. I mean, and of course, Chris was a Beatle, from the Beatles era too. And much like, having Eddie, I forget Eddie's last name, one of the EMI guys. All the EMI guys had a long history with Paul. And especially Phil McDonald, because Phil had worked, on Abbey Road too. I mean, I think we would have had Jeff Emmerich, but he was busy doing something else. But because Chris and Paul went back as far as they did, and Chris, when he was working on the White Album, when George Martin was not there, really kind of had learned how to deal with Paul on a creative level that would kind of cut through any kind of ego stuff and just get to the heart of making the music.
And what sort of things were you listening to in 1978, Laurence? What was informing your contemporary music at the time?
Boz Scaggs,
Right.
Two Down, Then Left, which is Jeff Porcaro on drums and Steve Lukather on guitar. Ry Cooder. Those were like my two favorite. What was it? I think it might have been Bob Till You Drop, or maybe that was a bit later. It was one of the Ry Cooder albums I was listening to a lot.
Silk Degrees, was it? Or Scaggs? Was that time?
No, I think wasn't it Two Down, Then Left? It was the one before Silk Degrees, I think.
But you weren't listening to punk or new wave at the time?
Not really. It's just wasn't particularly on my radar. But it's like, I mean, I would listen to anything if it, I mean, I get stuck in the YouTube rabbit hole, when if I go and study something, I'll kind of follow it back to its origins. So, I'm a pretty quick study whatever's going on stylistically. I mean, I think it would probably, was listening to more hard rock stuff, I'd be, whether it was Thin Lizzy or the Scorpions or stuff like that.
Were you able to talk to Paul in a meaningful way about any of the music that you were into? Like including the fusion stuff and that kind of thing. Was he interested, or was that something that was a bit?
We didn't really have those discussions. Linda, I mean, for example, Linda was a big fan of Stanley Clarke, which is why Stanley ended up playing on the Tug of War album. She confessed that he was her favorite bass player. Because you don't really have to think of Paul as a bass player. He's an artist. I mean, the bass was not even his his fourth instrument. I mean, trumpet, drums, guitar, and then bass. Oh, and keyboard. So maybe the fifth instrument. I mean, there might be some reference in passing, but we were, I think from my perspective, I was very just hyper focused on the music that we were making. I remember when we did, when we were doing the end of Getting Closer, I had spent the whole weekend like just figuring out different approaches to make that like an extended guitar solo. And we recorded a whole bunch of guitar solos from me that And Paul ended up saying, no, I think it should be like this. And he already had like the melody worked out for the very end of it. And that's he's entitled to do that. And I'd always play what he would request when he requested. And there wasn't a lot. I mean, there was only that, and there was on Daytime, Nighttime Suffering, there was a little guitar lick that he had kind of conceived as part of the composition. But most of the time, I was free to do what I wanted.
What were the origins of the flamenco solo you did on Good Night Tonight? How did that come about?
Well, we were at Rude Studio, because we couldn't get into Abbey Road in January of 1980. I think Cliff Richard had block booked it, and then Kate Bush was, on his heels. So Paul built this replica of the control room of Studio 2, and the plan was at that point we thought we were done recording and we were going to just mix. So we had the echo chambers like coming in over high resolution phone lines from Abbey Road, and we had all the gear that we needed to mix the record. But then Paul came in on the Monday morning with Daytime, Nighttime Suffering, and the studio was literally like a little kind of lobby area with a little kitchenette, and we set up the drums in the kitchenette, and we were all just kind of huddled around. It was really like a home studio, and we started work. We cut the track for Daytime, Nighttime Suffering, did some overdubs on that, and then went back to Good Night Tonight, and we're cooking it up with some guitar stuff. And there was an area where, I forget whether it was Paul or Chris Thomas said, hey, something kind of a Spanish style thing would work there. And they all looked at me, and I said, well, I don't have an acoustic guitar with me. So I borrowed Denny's Ovation Adamus, and they set up a mic, and I, just played the first thing that came out of my fingers. And I said something like that, and they said exactly like that. And that was what was on the record. So it was like first take.
Right. Can I ask
that thing of, like the improv thing of just being able to kind of be in the musical moment and not think about it. Yeah. And just again, a side note, Tom Scott's soprano sax on Listen to What the Man Said was him warming up. He was playing it with, this is from, because I wasn't at that session, but Denny said that Tom was playing the sax with one hand and writing out the chord changes with the other, but playing along with what he was hearing, and that was what ended up on the record. So,
yeah. Can I ask you about coming up, Laurence? When the single came out, were you a bit put out that he'd recorded a solo version? I know the live version got to #1 in America, but us in Britain were subjected to the studio version. So what's your feelings about the two versions? How do you compare them, and what do you think?
Well, it wasn't a surprise because we had heard it. We learned it from that, or at least the rough mix version of that. And so that was part of our show, when we did the UK tour. It was recorded in the second night in Glasgow. And once Paul got out of jail and we were back in the studio, we were actually at Rack Studios when we doubled the horns. We had the horn section come in and doubled them up. And that was kind of the last I thought about it. I mean, I knew that because of this deal that Paul had with Columbia, where he had a certain number of albums that he had to deliver, and McCartney 2 was going to be the next one up. But Wings was still a functional entity at that point. It's just, Paul had this solo album. And when they put it out, they put the live version on the B-side, which was cool. The record did not do well, even though they debuted the video on Saturday Night Live. The record was not getting much airplay until the DJs discovered that there was a live version, and then that went to #1. But it started off, the chart reports, the Billboard reports were on the studio version, and then it flipped and went over to the live in Glasgow one. So, which much to Columbia Records' chagrin, because they were forced to include a white label 7-inch single with the album, because people were buying the album expecting what they were hearing on the radio and not getting it. So they ended up including the live version with the McCartney 2 record. But I think what it represents from my perspective is that Wings, as we were constituted, really was a rock band. But where Paul was going with his creativity, first of all with the McCartney 2 stuff, which was, definitely kind of quirky and, playing in the studio with electronica. But then subsequently with the Tug of War stuff and Pipes of Peace, and you could see that when we were rehearsing the Tug of War stuff, we were doing it in a rehearsal, like in a hall. But this was material that normally I would have expected to have been worked out in the studio, because they weren't rock songs. They were pop songs and narrative songs and things that needed to be textured and dealt with in a very different way. So you had, Paul has a band that could play some kick-ass rock and roll, but is not writing stuff like that. The one song that he did have that we never actually did was No Values, which he said he dreamt he wrote a Rolling Stones song. But when he did it for the Broad Street movie, he didn't rock out as much as he should have, and he kind of wrote a new bit for it that really took it somewhere else. But it was clear, with songs like Ebony and Ivory and Average Person and stuff like that, that these weren't rock songs. You didn't need a rock and roll band to make a record like that. And then, I think, again, with some pressure from Columbia Records, that was when George Martin got brought in. And that was really the point where, okay, so this is no longer going to be a Wings album. And that was really kind of the beginning of the end of the band. But we were still in the studio in January of 1981, working on the Cold Cuts stuff. And a few things came out of that, like A Love for You. I'd put some slide guitar on that, and that ended up in a movie. And, at that point, I was already making plans to move to New York anyway.